Hello, hello, hello. The Eve Galer Fulcha on Shut A Potstilled Live. Fionnán, good evening, sir. How are you doing? Welcome to the show.
Hi, Augustosa. Grand. I'm just home from Belfast. So excuse the rattled hair. That's the train wind still blowing through.
You've got a look of Paul Kane about you.
Yeah, infectious. It's a minor variant up there. They're calling it the P variant, the pi variant, and you walk by and it's little droplets in the air and they just get into your hair and you kind of end up with this rough haircut. It's infectious, it's coming down here. Again, I've probably brought it, but inevitable, really.
Well, we know to blame you. Maricus Bridges saying hello in from Germany. We also have Connor dropping in from Dublin. And then, of course, Garrett Spence saying good evening to everyone. And to everyone who is watching at home, a very big welcome. I'm obviously joined by the fantastic Fionnán O'Connor. We are, throughout tonight's show, going to be talking all about vintage Column Still Mashbills across the history of Ireland and the Irish whiskey industry. Now, many of you will know and have remember Fionnán being on the show before, talking about his PhD work and his research about vintage Potstilled Mashbills, which would be some of the more well-known and more famous distilleries and mashbills across the history of Irish whiskey. But tonight we're going to drop into the lesser-known side of the history of Column Still Mashbills, which is going to be super interesting. Before we do that, I do want to say a big thank you to tonight's sponsor. So Kilbeggan Single Grain are sponsoring tonight's episode. So the guys from Kilbeggan Distillery, Beam Suntory, Beam Global, and Cooley Distillery are looking after us this evening. Personally, one of my favorite single grains on the market, which I was delighted. Fionnán in particular was looking forward to this being on the show. As you reminded me, Fionnán, one of the first single grains on the Irish market. So apt for this discussion, a historic single grain. Of course, matured in bourbon for about 7 years, and then it's got a little finish in some PX casks, and as well as that, some Madeira. So it makes for a very delightful drop. But I don't know, you've got some in your glass at the moment, Fionnán?
I do. Yeah, and literally, I would contend the first whiskey in the history of Irish whiskey to be labeled with the term single grain. There's grain whiskey in the history of Irish whiskey, but that term, it's really borrowed from Scotch and recent. Single grain Scotch borrows it from single malt Scotch, and then we borrowed it from single grain Scotch to make. But essentially, in terms of pure labeling history, the first single grain was Greenore, the original title for what's now Kilbeggan Single Grain.
Well, I am delighted to be having a little sip of it in my glass this evening. A lot of people dropping in as well to say hello from around the world. Dara Daly dropping in up here, dropping in from Scotland in his new role in a lovely newly refurbished Scotch whiskey distillery, of course. We've got Robert over in the continent saying hello. Sean O'Neill dropping in as well. There's a fantastic amount of people saying we've got Joe Van Name dropping in from Maryland, Eastern Shore, a lovely part of the world, and a fantastic accidental fireworks explosion in Ocean City, Maryland, over the 4th of July. So very topical to be on the shore of Maryland. We're going to have a lot of fun talking about this evening, and I'm delighted that you'll be joining us. I suppose, Fionnán, wow, there's a ton of people saying hello in the comments. And guys, do remember, as you're watching, you can have a huge amount of interaction throughout the show, because this is a topic that I know a lot of people are excited about. And get your questions in, because it's a topic not a lot of people know about, which is why I was so excited to have Fionnán on this evening to talk about this. So, Fionnán, it's a part of your PhD. It's definitely the side that is getting the least public attention. I suppose you're famously distilling old single pot still mash bills from across the history of the industry, but you're also uncovered a huge archive of column still mash bills and their use, and I suppose they're dying out, and then even recreating some. So why don't you tell us about, I suppose, its place in your PhD and where it goes from there?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even think when I started the PhD that, of course, it would entail this. But like you say, what is the history of Irish whiskey mash bills? It's a mash bill. And again, the column still is often seen as kind of an affront to the history of Irish pot still. That's certainly the story we tell ourselves. And one of the strong arguments maybe it's a very weak argument. One of the arguments I have routinely made is that Irish pot still essentially grew up in reaction to column still. I mean, even the name, as I know anyone who's heard me in a pub has possibly heard before, the name pure pot still only exists when there's an impure alternative. That part of the prestige came as a reaction to the existence of column still whiskey or blended down pot still, and for all they complain about the column still, their whole, hoity-toityness is buoyed up by the existence of this like massive well of grain liquor. And then I just started seeing that a lot of the stuff that was made was not the same grain whiskey that we think of today. And I mean, it's worth arguing. I'll put it this way: for those who don't know, anyone who doesn't read technical legislation the way I know Matt does, Irish grain whiskey and Scotch grain whiskey are not actually the same thing legally. And Irish whiskey, Irish pot still whiskey, despite being made in a pot, or on top of being made in a pot still, is mash bill defined, the minimum 30% malt and 30% barley for historical reasons. What a lot of people haven't spotted is that Irish grain whiskey is mash bill defined as well, because you can't have more than 30% malt. And so and that's again a nod back to history in Scotch whiskey. And it got me thinking when I was looking at these old, what is Irish grain whiskey, full stop? What is it now? What was it? And you look across the water, and the way the misunderstanding is, I mean, I'll take, and I gathered them up, which is why I was a little late to the test run. 4 Roses, single barrel, or what's left of it. Green Spot, or what's left of it.
So a theme.
Green Ore, single grain, or what's left of it. Crested 10, what's left of it. What do all of these have in common? If they were made in Scotland, they would be called a single grain legally. The Scotch whiskey legislation defines grain whiskey as almost a catch-all genre that's everything that's not malt. If you make, Buffalo Trace whiskies through, in Scotland, you're making single grain whiskey. If you make Redbreast, you're making single grain whiskey. If you make malt in a column still, if you make Nika coffee still, you're making single grain whiskey. Even though 99% of Scotch grain whiskey is exactly the same thing we mean when we call grain whiskey, column distilled, maize or wheat, etc., hot, low congener. The term exists in this like broad whatever, which is why like our Beaky Rye, these fun new expression in the Highlands, had to be called a single grain. Whereas in Ireland, much like the pot still definition, we legislate grain whiskey for history and say no, it has to go through a column still, and it has to be no more than 30% malt. And I don't think anyone had paid attention to the fact that we are as obsessed with history, possibly by accident, when we talk about grain whiskey as we are when we talk about pot still. It's flipped. Irish pot still does not just mean made in a pot still. Grain whiskey does not just mean made from grain. It has to be a column still. And the more I thought about this, the more interested I became in what the hell produced this? Why do we have this split image with Scotland, the way we think about ourselves? And of course with Scotch, it's, even though their grain whiskey, like if you buy like Canvas or Cameron Bridge or that awful Hague Club stuff, you're buying the same kind of grain whiskey, but legally, there's no distinction made. And I would argue that a lot of that is down to historical trajectories that have a lot to do with the whole of Irish whiskey history. The fact that Irish whiskey had to accommodate the existence of Irish pot still, and so said, okay, no, grain whiskey goes through a column, Irish pot still goes through a pot. These kinds of, they all exist in tandem with each other. Would be the kicking off point anyway to what got me more interested than just having to cope with the existence of grain whiskey in the past.
So I think a lot of people out there would have the misconception, and we hear from all of the different marketing houses that Ireland rejected the column still, which obviously isn't true. But there were, I suppose, industrialized scent. Now, Ireland didn't have a lot of the industrial revolution, but I know heavy industry and the likes of distilling did get that, and column stills were evident of that. Distilling hubs, when it came to column still production, we're looking towards the north, places where places perhaps you'd see shipbuilding and other heavy industries also got column stills. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, if you had a flax mill, you might have had a column still. That northeastern corner was where it really, there's exceptions, but in terms of like serious column distilling industry, in any resemblance to what was going on in the central belt of Scotland, you're talking about Belfast and its environs, and maybe out to Derry and down to Dundalk.
And so, as you said, mentioned there were other column stills, but perhaps that being a main hub, it somewhat separated from the likes of those who are making pot still, or distilling in pots. Would it all have been used exclusively for whiskey production, or would it have gone abroad? Would it have been all consumed in Ireland? Would it have gone into oil industries? What kind of intention had they set up when you're looking at this period? And also, what kind of time frame are we talking about when you're looking at the Northeast for column distilling?
Yeah, so to answer one by one, so depending on what era you're talking about, the high column still industry, and this is where a lot of the numbers get skewed, and we get very proud about how much Irish whiskey was made in the 1890s. And actually, an enormous, if you look at a column still distillery in the 1890s, they think of themselves, you take like, Connswater and Avonale, Belfast versus say like Cumber down the road or Bushmills up the road. And Cumber were making Irish pot still and Bushmills were making malt. And there's a fairy tale that Bushmills were making pot still in the 1890s, and that's not true. But certainly there's some ambiguity earlier, but by this point, Bushmills is making malt and Cumber's making pot still, but they both see themselves as making whiskey. Whereas if you look at these column distilleries, they're making alcohol first and foremost, a lot of which is whiskey. But for instance, if you put spirits beyond consumption, methylated alcohol and wood naphtha, anything, so it was strictly for medical or chemical use, you didn't have to pay excise. So it was a big take to just thump out this stuff. And then with the potable stuff, a lot of it is being sent off to Britain to be rectified into gin. So, and that's a huge industry. And that relationship between whiskey and gin is older than the column still. The idea of like mass rot gut just being sent down to be rectified. I mean, gin is a cool, well, I don't know, COVID has kind of put a damper on all the gin carry on, but it'll come back. But, historically, gin was primary, well, unless you go back to like Genever, in England from the 1710s, in its original boom, and then it died out, and then later on in the 1800s, it was primarily a way of masking alcohol. It's the world's first flavored vodka, or the world's first flavored, spirit base, where the point is to mask the spirit. And so you had an awful lot of, in the early days of gin, you had an awful lot of cheap rot gut flooding down from the lowlands of Scotland, from the Steens and the Haigs, these massive, low to the ground stills. And then that relationship is essentially reborn in the 1800s with the column still, where you have massive amounts of column still product going from lowland Scotland down to make gin, massive amounts coming over from Ulster to make gin. So it's more than just whiskey, which is what makes the like mash bill side of it, a little like, oh, who the fuck cares? But at the same time, it can be intensely interesting, and some of it did go to become whiskey, and that's worth talking about as well, and why all of these things happened. And, all these grains, have a functional process as well. Malt is not just made for flavors, malt because it's very good at making alcohol,
quite good. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, all and whenever I've had to look at this stuff, grain whiskey for me has been a wonderful wake up sounding board. Like when you're talking about just pure industry, they're using something for a reason. If they're making, high grade hooch, it's either to do with sourcing or to do with alcohol or to do with yeast cultivation or any of this stuff. And it's really refreshing to me because it wakes me up whenever I get kind of starry eyed about, the taste of various mash bills. And it's helpful because when you're looking at Potstilled, there's always the question, like, why didn't Potstilled just become great? Why didn't maize get run through a Potstill? Why wasn't that a thing? And when on the rare occasion that somebody does it, they're called out as like a charlatan, and is
that because it was a cheaper grain that people are just saying it was inferior, or that it just tasted impure? Like why I'm gonna play devil's advocate and pull on threads here, but why were they called out as charlatans?
They said it tasted bad. Full stop. They said it tasted bad, and they also said it was foreign. Two things that would call out maize. And again, like when you look at the history of the column still, it grew up with maize. We've been buying imported maize since we had single grain whiskey in Ireland. I hate to burst any bubbles. The column still was born in free trade, global agro economics. This massive piece of equipment that was capable of plowing through, huge quantities, once unimaginable quantities of grain, hit the industry just before the repeal of the Corn Laws, the change from protectionism to,
free trade.
Global. Yeah. So they are in the spirit of free trade.
Can I ask you one question then? You mentioned that, it's often mentioned that corn or maize is foreign. At the time, I know rye would have been somewhat indigenously grown, but it would have come from the colonies, which became the US 50 states. And Indian corn and rye would have been quite ample exports from there and imports into Ireland, which I presume would have arrived in tandem, and I presume would have been put through column stills in tandem. But yet we see small quantities, albeit, but we still see rye put through pot stills without the same fervor or angst. Was there a particular reason in your head why one got royal treatment over the other?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, like, I think it is that they could at least point the finger and say, rye's relationship with Ireland is really odd, because rye has been in Ireland since, at the very least, the Iron Age, possibly earlier, but at least the early Middle Ages, if not, again, the bleeding ground. It was there in the early Middle Age, so we assume it was there in the Iron Age. Could be older, and there's all kinds of myths of like Saint Molling bringing rye to Ireland. The Irish for rye is Chagall, which, if you ever look at like the French siècle, it sounds much more like the Latin languages, which is a clue that it's been here for quite some time. Obviously rye is a Germanic word, so the fact that the Irish clues into that older etymology is a giveaway. And anytime you see some place with the end name Tagal, like Cap and Tagal, that's on Tagal, knock on Tagal is hill of the rye. So it has been around and long enough to work its way into place names, but there's no, unless anyone can illuminate me, I've never seen any history of rye bread in Ireland. No real substantive. I know it used to be grown for thatch out in the Aran Islands and places. I know it was grown as, whenever I've talked to farmers are great. You cannot beat like real practical knowledge about someone telling you why something might have been grown or how it grows. Because that's, even in the age of global warming, there's certain, farmyard truths that are really helpful for looking at this stuff. But anyway, rye used to be grown as a cover crop. Rye used to be grown as a cover crop, essentially rejuvenate the soil. So you have it sown in that way. So you wonder, like, okay, there's no real history of rye bread. There's no real history of rye ale in Ireland, no real history of rye brewing. And then occasionally, like, what I used to find were records of something called maslin, and maslin is wheat and rye sown together in a field, and it's essentially like hedging your bets. Like if the wheat fails, the rye won't. And odd bit of trivia: the equivalent for oats and barley sown together is called dredge, hence the term. But anyway, so
is it like a hybrid grain or just sowing the same field with the two seeds?
Like a hybrid grain is triticale.
Yeah.
But no, this is just like scattering seeds in tandem. And maybe there's some agricultural reason, I don't know, other than just like, I always thought about it as like, well, if one fails, the other survives. But if maybe they grow up well together, I don't know. But this was definitely, meslin and dredge were both, practices. And sometimes it's called maslin, but same thing. Anyway, so it's been there. You see references to like bans on distilling in the 1700s that say like no distilling of wheat, rye, maslin, oats, barley, flour, porridge, and there's a long list, but rye is in there. So it's you have something, you'll distill it. Obviously rye was very associated with the Low Countries, with the Netherlands, with Genever, the ancestor to gin. And there's attempts in Scotland to like edge in on the early gin market, or what they call Geneva, essentially, which was just despite the fact that Geneva is not in the Netherlands, was a term for Dutch gin because they couldn't pronounce Genever, or Geneva. But anyway,
the Dutch in the comments are turning and seething with pronunciations going on.
Because as far as I know, and I stand to be corrected, it's Genever in Dutch, and then it became Ginevra, and I've heard Genever in the middle, and then gin is from Ginevra, which a lot of people misunderstood for meaning Geneva, as in the city in Switzerland, which is actually just the anglicization of the name of that city, and I've been told that that's not how the Swiss say it. So it's it's up in the air. There's a lot of ducks flying. You're going to shoot one of them once in a while. If you say it, funnily enough, someone will think you're talking about a different drink. But anyway, there were attempts, industrially to replicate this, and especially during the gin boom in Britain. But again, it's when you look in an Irish context, when rye comes into Irish pot still, and this is one of the big mysteries for me, and I think I may have gotten to the root of it, but I have to talk to some people who know what they're talking about when in terms of like brewing chemistry. But when it comes in, it's used as about 0 to 5% of the pot still mash, tiny proportion. Versus when it comes into column stills in Ireland, it's like 20 to 35% of the mash. It's thumping through them. And a big part of that seems to have been, again, before we get any misty-eyed, it's about yeast cultivation. It's about, rye. Apparently the properties of rye lend themselves to growing yeast. Yeast feeds on them very, very well, like nitrous peroxide. And again, this is where I need to start talking to someone with some actual chemistry background. But there seem to have been distilleries that were distilling high rye to try and get a side hustle, as it were, of yeast cultivation. So there's things that kind of kick in. But there's the question of like, well, if they're using that for the side hustle there, why aren't they doing the same thing for pot still? Or was that what's going on for the pot still, but just in low quantities? But that doesn't make any sense. That's so tiny, So the only thing I can guess, and I've been wondering this for ages, why like old Jameson had like 2% rye in it, is if it's good for yeast to eat, it may encourage the brewing itself, because it comes in late into Irish pot still. Early Irish pot still is all malt, raw barley, and oats, and then there's the big wheat boom, and then suddenly it's this kind of tumbling order mash bill of like oats, wheat, rye as the adjuncts, and there's the rye is always really, really small, and then in the 20th century the rye is the first to die off, and the others kind of exist in tandem. But anyway, the column still stuff, there's always the great question of like why they did not collapse into a similar thing, because you're talking about fermented wash. That's what the grains are giving you, and surely if one is more productive, then it's you think they would at least be similar, but they get more and more and more different. So when the column still, to answer your original question, when the column still is first patented, 1828 to 1830, steam coffee. There's earlier column stills, if anyone's not familiar with Robert Stein, he beat Aeneas Coffey to it in Scotland. He was the scion of the infamous Stein, Hague, Split, cheap Scotch rock cut families to which the Jamesons were related. So, there's a lot of history there. but they were both beaten by, again, earlier model in Ireland, and then the real inventor. Well, you have like Paracelsus way back with theory of fractionation, but the first kind of major successful still was Jean-Baptiste Cellier Blumenthal in France, and he was working off a guy named Edouard Adam. So it pops up. The truth is the French beat us to it, but they beat the Scots as well. But coffees is the first that really doesn't need to be stopped, is the big thing. And if you look at a coffee still, you know that little valve at the bottom that dispenses with oils? That's coffee's real contribution. If you want to nail it down to one thing, it's making the stills out of copper, perforating them, and giving them that, so that they don't need to stop them, and you don't get this horrible like sulfurous oil on the other side. But that's all the 1830s when that comes on tap. And the first column still mash bills just looked like Irish pot still, or what was still around, a kind of a Scotch mixed mash through a column still. And then as Irish pot still becomes more identifiably Irish, to the point where like even when the Scots are making it, they're calling it Irish style whiskey, and it's becoming more specific and more well defined and more prestigious. And at the same time, you're getting that column still, which began using those same grains, suddenly realizing, right, I'm the free market and I'm going to use the grains, So like I was reading through some old DCL records, so Distillers Company Limited, the ancestor to Diageo, who were Scottish, but a good place to get your bearing. And they never used more than 6% domestic grains. It's hilarious. There was so little tied back to Scotland. It was when you look at their column stills, and it got even lower than that. That was like the high point was like 5.8, because it was just thumpings of maize or barley from the Balkans, or not the Balkans, the Baltic, barley from Europe, barley from Australia, barley from all over the place. But the column still represented a world that was so different to what the malt and pot still distillers were capable of embracing. And then they get into this world of like free trade grain, and you have this equipment that's capable of making heaps and heaps and heaps of alcohol. And suddenly they're in really ferocious competition with each other, where it's the idea like, if he gets proper grain sourcing, he can make like the only thing left to pay for is grain. That's the single largest cost by heaps. And so there's this like flat race to the end of the world to get and it veers off. And then by necessity, the malt and the Irish pot still distillers, they're bogged down. You look at the Highland malt distillers, and most of you're getting this weird relationship where like they buy barley from the farmers and then they sell draft back for cattle, and they have these kind of like not petty, but like local relationships, and they don't want to abandon those, and then they have to pay the middlemen if they want grain from abroad, and it's just easier to get grain locally, and there's all this mystique. And I was reading an article about grain whiskey versus malt whiskey in Scotland, and it was saying there was like the malt distilleries didn't hire chemists until the First World War. It was so much about tradition and mystique and this and that, and the column distillers did have chemists and people talking about yield and what varietals give us higher alcohol content, full stop. And the column still industry was based on this whole different world, but at the same time, for all of its reasoning, it was different. Irish grain whiskey would have been now higher proof than pot still, obviously, but still different. You give someone a glass today of grain whiskey made from maize and wheat, and you can tell the difference. They are obviously less
distinctly different. Yeah,
they're distinct. So if you look there's to give an idea of how odd these were. Connswater Distillery in Belfast had a policy of using 19 to 27% malt, 23 to 37% rye, and 35 to 58% maize. Again, much looser than pot still mash bills, because they're all about sourcing, so it's just parameters. But you think like, what? Malt, rye, and maize is grain whiskey? Or you take like what else have I got here? Before the Royal Commission, there was 28% malt, 36% rye, 38% maize brought up as worth, 36% maize brought up as one. There was one that was 35% malt, 65% barley and maize. And then shortly thereafter, I found a domestic imports report from the USA, Same thing that informs one of the mash bills I was talking to you about. So in that same one, so you know the one I'm talking about, which unfortunately can't reveal because it's in the thing. But it also came with a column still definition, and it says 60 to 75% maize, 15% oats, which doesn't make a whole lot. Those numbers don't add up. But presumably the remainder is malt. But again, like you're thinking, well, why the hell were there oats in column stills? What's the point of this? So like maize, I understand, for the same reason that like this is all but a small amount of malt, all maize. And, Middleton grain whiskey is essentially 5% malt and 95% maize. The core Middleton, I know they do some funky stuff, but the stuff that goes into Jameson is maize, and Cooley was maize. And Cooley, maybe even accidentally, made a big statement when they used maize, because as you know, most of the default grain in Scotland is wheat, which historically is its own kind of phenomenon, and so they have ended up being different. And I remember talking to Brian Watts up at Great Northern. He was talking about how much he preferred maize distillate, or how much it had come as a shock. He did say prefer, but I assume he liked what he was making before as well, just fine.
To clarify, he's made both maize and wheat based grain whiskey, both in Ireland and in Scotland as well, just to bookend that point.
Yes. And so what is, why does that happen? So if you want, we can go back and just like trace the mash bills as they occur, or
absolutely. Fionnán, I'm going to do one thing. You start telling us about that. I just need to turn on one light here. I forgot to turn it on, and I will be back in 3 seconds.
Grand. He'll be back in 3 seconds. For whoever's watching, what doesn't work, and what I've been looking forward to, Murphy's brown bread ice cream. I had thought, and I went out and got some, and I was going to have the big reveal here and like nom down on it with some of this just poured over, because it tastes like honeycomb. And I was like, this is going to work
quite
so
delicious.
Yeah, it doesn't work at all. Like ice cream and whiskey have like really different viscosities, and I just felt like really sad, and it kind of turned into this gloop, and I tried some spoonfuls of it. I mean, I finished it, but I need to kind of rethink my life
on its own, though. Murphy's brown bread ice cream is fantastic.
Oh yeah, and again, like ice cream, and again, like grain whiskey, and like my great loves in whiskey very much are like heavy, oily, dense Irish Potstilled, for those who haven't heard, and heavily peated and well peated malt whiskey, Isle of Scotch, and American rye, real American rye, aggressive American rye. And so grain whiskey is the opposite of all three of those things at once. It's hard to be the opposite of more than one thing, but it is. And yet, I really do enjoy it, and I like Green Ore a lot. Or Kilbeggan grain whiskey a lot. I remember Green Ore, and it was such a breath of fresh air in Irish whiskey at the time. I mean, Green Ore came out, I don't know if it was the same year as Connemara. It was either the late 90s or the first, like 2001. It was really around the year 2000, and there was because Cooley before, obviously Cooley started in the end of the 80s, and started releasing like Locks and Tyrconnell and all these things in the 90s, and then suddenly really came into its own with these two statements: peated malt and single grain. And again, in the context of like when I started drinking whiskey, Green Ore was so fun, and it was so different, and it wasn't a blend, and it wasn't pot still, and it was light, and it was kind of carefree. And it's it doesn't get the credit it deserves, for, despite the fact that like the great secret is there's been grain whiskey and column stills for ages, but the question is, what do we do with single grain now? We're not actually obliged to do very much with it other than make it in column stills, and not include more than 30% malt. But there's a whole lot of space there. We're not even, and like most of what we use, like this obviously was distilled to a very high fraction, plus it came off still over 90%. We're not even required to do that. You look at like, okay, what's the difference between this and this? This is bourbon. Obviously, bourbon has a lot of internal definitions about casks, etc. But it was made from a mash of about 30. This is a very high rye bourbon, about 35% rye, 10% malt, and the rest is maize. It's and a lot of bourbon is a lot more maize. And it was distilled in a column still. Now it came off at a much lower percentage. Bourbon can't go above 80% in distillation, but it's so more congenite retentive, and it's much lower than 80%. This particular one, but there's a lot of space to play, and I don't know if we ever will, if it's just a concept, but it is worth looking back at where we came from, where grain whiskey started and what happened and how we got where we are. And there's a lot of like peculiar quirks along the way, and I think things that can help people when they, especially people who drink stuff from before, understand why like IDL blends from the 90s don't taste like IDL blends from the 2000s. And you take, well, like IDL switched to wheat grain whiskey, little known fact. And after they were set up to make maize. They switched to wheat, kept making wheat for a while, and then in 1994 they ceased wheat distillation and switched back to maize. And if you taste and so you give it a few echo years to cop on, and they taste different. But we never got to try those independently, So grain whiskey, despite being the major partner of most Irish blends, doesn't get the look in it deserves, And there's a lot there. The fact that like Blackbush to this day is made with a different grain whiskey to Whitebush. Another thing most people don't know, and is totally to do with history. And so I was finding these, why was it considered when Middleton started supplying grain whiskey to Bushmills? Why did Blackbush have to get something different? And I think history chalks up these answers. They're strange, bewildering, fun.
Well, I'm going to say before you go on, and it's a rare moment I get you to take a breath. So again, just a big thank you to Kilbeggan and their single grain whiskey that we are both imbibing on this evening. And I'm very delighted to have them as a sponsor of tonight's show. You can find it, of course, on the likes of Irish Malts and Celtic Whiskey Shop. It's approximately around $39.95. 95. I don't think anyone really does 99s anymore, but about 95. Fantastic whiskey to be dropped straight to your door, and even less for our friends who are paying in punts. But Fionnán, why don't you walk us through some of the mash bills as they occurred?
Sure. So I suppose the odd thing is you almost have to start with Potstilled mash bills to see what was there when Aeneas Coffey patents it. So in 1830, what's going on? The malt tax is still heavily in force, for one thing. And you have in the Potstilled records at the time, very, very like you'd be lucky to get 25% malt. It was very luxury whiskey to get malt that high. When you look at some of these Potstilled mash bills, they weren't really Potstilled either, and you get thumps of oats or thumps of wheat, and you get again, like Scotland has made mixed mash bill despite what it tells itself or what the official narrative of Scotch whiskey is, but it dies off and then it's reborn as imitation Irish whiskey. There's like two waves, but they're not as split as people think they are. It never really dies off, but definitely starts being thought of as Irish whiskey. But of course, when you're looking at the Steens and the Hagues and these lowland Scotch whiskies, and the whole story there is that this stuff was shit, which seemingly it was, and that the malt whiskies of the Highlands were of a superior grade. Now they were also using like small stills, actual copper interaction, whereas what the lowland distilleries were using was these like flat, and I've seen pictures, diagrams, these kind of like saucer stills with low necks, no reflux whatsoever, no copper. So, the mixed mash was on only one side of it. Whereas in Ireland, we illegalized that crap. And you couldn't have a still wider than it was tall and all this stuff. And you start getting geometric regulations from a guy named Wall.
And for no apologies, Gary Mills just dropped in saying, what period are you talking about that the Scots are using these mixed mash bills?
So late 1700s. Same, high 1700s would be the best. Like Adam Smith once said, in what one calls malt spirit, of course, great Scottish economist, randomly had something to say about whiskey. And he said, in what one calls malt spirits, malt makes up about a third of the parts, the other 2/3 being either raw barley or wheat. Raw barley or again, so he basically says like a third each way. The way he phrases it is, 1/3 raw barley and 1/3 wheat, which is quite high wheat, actually, funnily enough. And so you get this weird, history is very muddy. I mean, the same way that there was malt whiskey made in Ireland. And, like, I hate to be the one breaking this news, and I've broken it before, but like, malt whiskey was thought of, by the time this dichotomy emerges, malt whiskey was thought of as Scottish as Irish pot still was Irish. So when you see, like, when Alfred Barner, the great, just the first whiskey writer, really rocks up to Cameron Bridge, this lowland column still distillery, they've installed pots, and they tell him, we make 4 products: grain whiskey, malt whiskey, silent malt, grain whiskey, and pot still Irish. And what the hell does this mean? So clearly, grain whiskey, silent malt is clearly malt run through a column still, and then malt, and then pot still Irish is mixed mash through. So they just divide it logically, but they don't blush saying they make Irish whiskey in the middle of, the Scottish Central Belt. And there's a lot of that made. And then you look over, like in 1908, when there's the big commission, they point to Bushmills and Coleraine and say they use the Scotch practice, and it's astounding. They had become imaginatively different. And again, a big part of the argument of the thesis is like, why in the 1700s, when of course Ireland had its own, it was a crown dominion, but we had Henry Grattan's parliament and were theoretically autonomous, not autonomous, but self-governing within a certain elitist degree. Why was it that won't go into the thesis, readings of Grattan's parliament. But why in that period, when they should have been very different, was there so much overlap between Ireland and Scotland? And then in 1801, after the Second Act of Union, the Irish Act of Union, when we're in the United Kingdom, we're supposed to be the same state. The excise system is trying desperately to homogenize itself. Why is that when we like veer off and mixed mash made in Scotland is called Irish and the same vice versa? So there's a lot. So there's a weird history. In fact, I'd encourage anyone who hasn't seen it. Dave Broom and Arthur Mockley did like a YouTube talk called the Liquid Antiquarian, where they talk about Scotch whiskey history, and they do one on, again, the like ambiguities where even the Highland distillers could be, history is muddy and dirty and strange. You like lift up rocks and you find, Bushmills making pot still and all this stuff kind of oozes out. And similarly, they were finding like Lefroy making a mixed mash of a kind. But it's important to remember that mixed mash in principle is not the same thing as Irish pot still as it developed into its identity. The difference between what the Steens were making and the like 40% malt, 40% raw barley, 14% oats, 5% wheat, 1% rye, described by guys like Andrew Jemison in the early 20th century. That looks very, very different. And so, history is the result of its trajectories, and it's important to remember. But yeah, Scotland has, you look at like even well before any of this, you distill what you have. You get like drinks like Trishtarig out in the Hebrides, this like triple distilled oat stuff that there's a travel writer named Martin Martin, which sounds like a funny name. It is, he was from the Isle of Skye, and so his name is literally like Marcin Macilavarcin, and it just anglicized to Martin Martin. But he describes various drinks that they're drinking, and he describes the Quake, which is to this day the keepers the Quake and all this stuff. So Martin Martin's very important to people's understanding of Scotch whiskey history, even though they really just throw away lines in another book altogether, which is just about the Hebrides. But anyway, he describes them distilling oats. So there's bound to be overlap, in the same way that we tell ourselves that Ireland invented mixed mash bills to dodge the malt tax, and you see like people using raw barley about a century before, and it's not that simple. You don't just like click a button and then people think things, and people in Scotland don't think the same things. You're talking about trends or reactions or what becomes, and then by the toward the like high period, they start talking about this stuff as tradition, an Irish tradition, a Scottish tradition. But traditions only exist when there's a bit of the past behind you, you know, to kind of say, well, most of us do this, you know, and we've been doing it for some time. We've gotten very good at it. And that's where you start seeing it spread. So yeah, there is a complex history to address that question of mixed mash bills in Scotland. Not always the same mixed mash. In fact, usually not. Even when they're imitating it, not the same.
I like, so it's a complicated web of history, and obviously very interesting, I think, as well. When we see that that malt is considered the Scottish tradition, and I'm sure when you're researching all of this, there's obviously got to be a lot of interesting finds, and obviously you're going through, you know, PRONI, the Public Records Office in Northern Ireland, which I suppose arguably have some of the better held records than the Republic, and then, you know, you're going through record offices, and I presume tax records is where you're seeing a lot of this. How, outside of, I suppose, excise tax records, which I guess I'm not no historian, but I assume they'd be pretty meticulous, and you can assume that they're semi-truthful and correct. When you're looking outside of those, how do you verify, or what's the stages you need to take where someone like Alfred Bernard says, "Oh, John Jameson was making bourbon in the 1500s," and just because it's something that actually you taught me, that just because it's written down in history doesn't mean that it's true. And you gave previously a great example about how all Bretons thought that they came from the siege of Troy. But when you're doing this kind of research, what kind of grains of salt or analytical, I suppose, referencing do you have to do before it goes into the PhD?
Yeah, I mean, again, like there's a lot of bullshit in our own age. I've probably told some without, you know, by knowing, but it gets out, you know, and I think that's the first thing to trying to get like beyond like historical interest and research, is knowing that there was bullshit in the past too. That just because you see something written down in the 1800s about the 1800s doesn't mean it's true. And certainly if you see something written down in the 1800s about the past before it, you know, like history has gotten better and more rigorous over time. You look at stuff from the 19th century, it's like bewildering bullshit. And then like, yeah, my original background was doing medieval stuff, and, you know, they'd say like the Gaels came from Egypt. No, it's pure horseshit. But they're in that sense, they're trying to aggrandize themselves and, you know, create some sort of like biblical lineage. And there's a very real way of talking about why. There's whole heaps of why they would say that. But like you get like you know, a lot of people didn't speak Irish in the 1800s. And occasionally there's this thing that floats up where it says like whiskey is from Ishka Bui, yellow water. And that's pure horseshit. But it's said by, I don't even think it's Samuel Morwood. It might be, but it's someone from around there. And then it gets repeated by like two people afterwards. And it's of course like historically nonsensical. There's no evidence, you know, the etymology is very, very clear. But, you know, it pops up and you have to kind of like, okay, he's clearly quoting him and he's clearly quoting this guy who didn't know what he was talking about, and none of them spoke the language in the first place. They're all just quoting each other. And there's a lot of that white noise, you know, and people come up with crap, especially when they're trying to brand something. You know, it's
not a modern phenomenon.
Yeah. That's, you know, and not to go at marketing, you know, there's plenty of marketeers who draw genuine inspiration from the past and are very sincere about it, but there's always been bullshit, and there probably always will be bullshit. And we've got the capability now to call it out when people spin these willful yarns, and often they'll take recourse to history, and that's where, you know, I hope the thesis can be of help of like settling some of that stuff. But aside from, you know, actual lies, the past can be very difficult to define, because like, for instance, when you're reading the excise, okay, they're very meticulous, but the distillers are clearly lying to them, you know, and especially in the early stuff. And so you have to, you know, the most, you know, kind of pinnacle of the pyramid is if you get production books, something that's purely functional and in-house, and like, okay, that's trustworthy. And then you get like in court testimonies where you know, there's something on the line, and then you get like excise have been really intrusive and have been watching them. and it's in their best interest to stay on. And then, like at the very bottom, you get, I hate to say it, but you get advertising, and and I think the other thing is a lot of people take history with modern terms, and we forget that history was heavily deregulated. So, for instance, you see like there was some Jameson's labeled Jameson malt whiskey. Was it malt? No. If you look into it, what essentially it's malt was a deregulated term, just like anything. They were saying they used a lot more malt, almost like the bourbon methodology. Rye whiskey means you have to be 51% rye or above, kind of like it's mostly rye. So if you say malt whiskey, it's got a high malt content. They didn't even mean it in like 51%. It's like, oh yeah, it's malt whiskey. It's proper. It's not this maize stuff. But the terms bleed, and not to mention like Potstilled, of course, can be really ambiguous. So all this stuff. So like for instance, Alfred Barnard visits. I chased this for ages. Glen Distillery in Cork, in Kilnap. Yeah. Barnard says the make is called pure malt whiskey. And then he visits Coleraine Distillery and he says, it is the first of the 2 malt distilleries in Ireland. He says there's only 2 pure malt distilleries, or all malt, which is very explicit. He says only 2 distilleries use nothing but malt. And it's really odd because he went to Coleraine after Glen Distillery. And you think, well, surely this is the second. And then there's a reference earlier to Bushmills just before Coleraine, and he doesn't say what they use. And so a lot of people have taken that mistakenly, I think, into thinking that Bushmills didn't make malt whiskey. But actually, if you look, it's clearly an editorial mistake where like he went from Coleraine to Bushmills, and Bushmills somehow ended up in the previous chapter, because you look at his trajectory and he's like, from Coleraine we came to Bushmills, even though Bushmills was before. So Coleraine is the first, then Bushmills is the second, which again would tie up with most of the rest of the history. Was that malt, I mean, by 1850 there was, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, there was no malt of any sort of scale made south of Ulster. You see these commissions and they say, yeah, and it's really no legal malt. Of course, it was malt putching, and that's a very different story. But we're talking about like legal Irish distilling, which is very easy to track. And I've shown you those. You get some pot still distillers that like faffing around with malt once in a while, but even that seems to have been just knocked in, and they were probably doing it to cut taxes, because you got rebates if you use nothing but malt. So you see this like weird, sometimes they do a bit of malt, and it's clearly like when the excise showed up. Yeah, look at the malt we make, how much tax we should, but again, and then it just seems to get absorbed. So almost weirdly enough, a bit like Writer's Tears done by accident, like malt and pot still mixed together in-house. But again, with a lot less malt than even Writer's Tears has, let alone the Irishman. I mean, again, we're talking like, you look at like the 1820s, Ireland didn't make more than, I've shown you that stuff. By the 1820s, even before the column still, Ireland was making no more than 5% malt whiskey. And that when
cap, right, that was the pinnacle of malt production.
And then the column still comes on stream. And so like, out of 79 distilleries, 4 of them made malt. Out of, when Barnard came, 28 distilleries, 2 of them made malt, Coleraine and Bushmills. So it in the same way, there was, when you look at putching, there's like a lot of, there's a lot of malt putching. But again, then you're talking about like oaten malt as well as barley malt, and it's smoked. It's a different drink in and of itself in many cases. So, but there's certainly a route there, and I think one thing I've tried to tackle in the thesis is talking about these like simple, often false narratives, like there was malt whiskey in Ireland, and then the malt tax came and we invented pot stilling. Well, the first records of distilling in Ireland, of grain distilling, are all about wheat and oats and all this stuff. Where the hell did that go? And then you look right before, and then we're using raw barley before the malt tax happened. But what the malt tax did do was it put the thumb down really hard on anyone who had notions of making malt whiskey, and by the time it's taken off, why doesn't Ireland recalibrate to malt almost immediately? It doesn't make the slightest bit of sense. But then you also have these column still mashbills, which, and certainly in the imagination, and this is where Scotland gets its imagination. You go back to the 1700s and tax records divide between malt spirit and grain spirit, or sometimes they call it corn spirit, because of course corn originally just means anything with a kernel. It's like the German corn, it means grain. And American corn we've now adopted via American English, or Indian corn, into referring to maize. But like you still find, like I've heard people say in Donegal, like our granddad used to say they were bringing in the corn for oats. You know, so when you talk about these old corn laws and whatnot, there is that sense of it being of it being grain of any kind. But you get, where was I going with that?
Talking about malt, 5%, no greater than.
Oh yeah, you start looking at these early records, and they're saying like, okay, the first explicit record to like popular distilling of grain alcohol in Ireland is from the Irish town markets of Kilkenny. Not the same thing as the Red Book of Austria at all, but also happens to be in Kilkenny. And they're complaining about it, and it says, you know, it doth make the price of wheat and other corns dear. And you're like, okay, wheat and other corns, you know, and so like right from the beginning, then the next, you know, reference are all things like the Drogheda of Parliament banning the distillate. There's a lot of things about wheat because, of course, wheat was a valuable commodity, and banning that. Now, this is all ancient history by the time we get the column still, but the column still is a great example of how like pragmatism that had existed within the pot still distilling industry beforehand starts to shape itself as like, you want to talk about pragmatism, we'll talk about like cheap as chips maize from the other side of the world and see how pragmatic you are. And then is when pot still starts to get notions about itself. And it's almost like in tandem with that we end up with, you know, gentlemen distillers and old Irish pure pot still and this and that. But the original logic is just tax. Malt spirits get a rebate. They get a little bit of tax back as a thank you for using nothing but malt. And anything else, grain spirits. And it's funny because, you know, that lingers on in the Scotch imagination legally, that, you know, grain whiskey just means anything else. And in Ireland, it doesn't. And grain whiskey starts to mean Irish column stills specifically. And by contrast, Irish pot still is different, but also Irish pot still is different to Scotch pot still, meaning malt whiskey. And it's in not cooperation, but like intolerance of each other that these things developed. And so it became essential to like work out what the column distillers were doing. So yeah, the first one, so like the Irish pot still of the era, very, very low malt content, like, you know, anywhere from like 10 to 25, maybe, you know, pushing 30. Very, very low. And then high amount of raw barley. And then you're talking about like a third oats. And a third oats is interesting because that's a mystery I was talking about for a long time, which was that, you know, occasionally you hear about reference to oats, and you say it's all just filtration. But you look at the people who were filtering with oats, and it's like 2 to 7%. And then you look at people like using 30 to 40% oats, and say that's no longer filtration. That's something different.
It's a big filter.
Yeah. And I a while ago, there's this thesis by someone named Deirdre Priestley, and I've never met her, but she wrote a thesis out in Maynooth on the Powers family specifically, and there's a bit in there about, and I'd seen this reference crop up less defined, but it has an interview with someone at the Powers Distillery when they were using higher oats, and saying that like it creates certain enzymes that aid the maturation, or aid the fermentation. And you look at like old, and I know I had you guys do with enzymes and without back to back, and you know, the drops weren't as severe. Now, of course, we're dealing with like modern circumstances, and distillers yeast and all this stuff. But it is interesting that you look at these older references and they say like oats help compensate for low malt in a way. They kind of bring up some of the ground. So there's practical, even in the like starry-eyed history of Irish pot still, there's practicalities at play. And, you know, and of course, like, you know, most distillers were using between.
Oh no. I think it's possibly the only thing that could have stopped Fionnán in the middle of that spiel is his internet crashing. We'll hopefully be able to get him back on in a moment. For anyone that is still watching and wants to have a moment, take this pause of Fionnán's breath for a moment and throw any questions you do have into the comments section. And let us know what the comments that you want to ask Fionnán, or what are the questions that you've always wanted to know, whether that be about kind of, you know, we're talking about mixed column still mash bills here. I did see a question earlier on from Connor, who's asking whether or not people were experimenting with lower casting strength of Irish grain when we were talking about the differences between Irish grain whiskey and bourbon being matured in column stills. And I think more to Fionnán's point was that the American grains through columns are being taken off the stills at lower refraction points, so at a 60% or a 65% instead of or up to say 80%, but below the standards that they require in bourbon, which are much lower than the maximums you can bring Irish whiskey to. So rather than casking strength, actually the strength, you're going to be able to take it off the still. But don't worry, Fionnán, I think, is coming back. He just popped in there 1 second. We will be able to bring him back in 1 second. I do see Conor Ryan dropping and say it is a cliffhanger. And James Loughran, a good grain man, saying no. Don't worry, Fionnán is coming back. He, I think, is just having a slight connection issue. So there's a good question here that's saying, when did French corn start to become a large component? I don't have I am not the historian of this group. I'm definitely much more on the modern production practices, and that's where Fionnán and myself balance each other nicely. As far as I understand, French maize or French corn came in with the kind of the rise of the Pernod Ricard grain distilling of the mid 90s. And it's blue French corn. It's non-GMO, as far as I know, but not certified for, depending on what farms you're going to, for other things like halal and organic. But that, I think, is the origins of French maize coming into the Irish whiskey industry. But I'm delighted Fionnán is back joining us. Fionnán, you left us on a cliffhanger there. And actually, a good question for you. Do you know when French maize overtook Indian corn coming from the Americas as the main proponent? I'm thinking Pernod's switch from...
Yeah. So originally it's all coming transatlantic is the big thrust. You have a lot of barley coming from Europe. And again, like, even for the barley content, and I was amazed how little DCL, the big Scottish column stiller giant of the late 19th and 20th century, and in its current incarnation is Diageo, still a giant. But anyway, how little of that was homegrown, because it just became so big that you needed large bulk purchases, and that came on the free global tide, as it were. But yeah, there is the question of, so what happened? So why does it become, when we think of, like, I'll pour some more of this. And
well, hang on. Before you fully articulate that question, in the comments, do let us know if you do have questions for Fionnán, because we'll have a little section at the end to try to answer some of your questions. So Fionnán, please continue and drop into the comments section if you do have questions about the history of column still mixed mash bill distilling in Ireland.
Yeah. So we talked about, like, the original columns look a lot like the Potstilled whiskey of the time, and of course they're making what they call grain whiskey, but they're making it in columns. And the Potstilled distillers say that's not real whiskey. But the mashes aren't all that different. Very low malt content, oats, barley, etc. And in 1846. When you talk about, like, the history of Irish agriculture, and it is difficult to talk about, because of course brewing and distilling both revolve around the history of grain, and it's uncomfortable to talk about it, but we don't, and there's a few bullshit solutions that aren't anything but revisionism. But it is distilled from grain. There was a big famine. And the brewing and distilling industries grew through them and actively profiteered on the back of legislation that was meant to address them. And you get this, but one of the, as anyone who's looked into the history of the famine or of Irish 19th century economic history will be aware, probably the most talked about thing is something called the Corn Laws. Not to be confused with Foster's Corn Laws, which is something different. But the Corn Laws were protectionist legislation meant to artificially inflate the price of grain, essentially brought in after the Battle of Waterloo, after European channels started coming in, because Napoleon blockade dropped, and you started seeing floods of cheap European grain. And folks in the House of Lords weren't happy and wanted their land to still be, financially buoyant. And you had riots in the streets of London over it because it artificially inflated the price of bread. And all of this was like unfair and bad economics and protectionism. But then the Irish famine hits, and you suddenly have this like calamity where, it's a huge disaster, agri-social catastrophe, and you have wheat and cereals are artificially expensive. And two things are happening. One, they're being shipped out to recuperate lost landlord costs because they've lost profits, and this is artificially expensive, and you have like literally food on the table. And two, the whole mechanism of the Corn Laws was essentially a restrictive tariff system that made it impossible to bring, well, not impossible, but very, very unlikely to bring in grain from abroad that might have been cheaper and might have fed the poor and so forth. And so there's this catastrophe. And on the back of this, Robert Peel, who was prime minister, teams up with Wellington, who was in the House of Lords, and the two of them, to their credit, get it repealed. And again, a lot of the people who repealed it were more interested in free trade than they were in the Irish famine. But it does become the watershed moment. And from that point onwards, and over here it was kind of too little, too late, and the whole thing was just spiraling down. But in the long memory, you get a number of ricochets. One, wheat tillage in Ireland just fell through the floor, which is immediately significant for mash bills, which explains why they could be like up to 40% a decade before, and then they're like 0 to 15% therever after, and eventually around 5%. And wheat tillage dropped to being like 8% of what it had been. So you get, a big difference in the actual like agricultural history of Ireland, but you also get a difference in the way people talk about agriculture. And it, again, like, it's not just weepy-eyed sympathizers of the people who were like.
Well, a very unfortunate second drop off of internet connection there. Perhaps we'll be able to answer one or two more questions, and if Fionnán's not back, I think we're at a good end of this evening's. Yes, as Connor says. Oh dear. Unfortunate for Fionnán, lives in a little bit of an internet problem spot, so I do feel for him, and he's been having great so far. I do see, Connor, you've touched back on the point about casking grain whiskey at lower ABVs. And I did touch on the fact that in the US, you're taking them off lower points, tend to have a lot more flavor, esters and compounds at that lower ABVs, which changes the flavors when you're casking, usually around the same ABV. But when you're casking in a barrel, you've got water soluble and alcohol soluble flavors. Too high, you're going to get a lot of the aggressive flavors. Too low, and essentially you have slower or quite a different maturation of grain whiskey. Or of any whiskey really, but when you're distilling to a strength of close to 94% alcohol, you're stripping a huge amount of that flavor. So experimentation at casking at lower ABVs wouldn't have as of great of impact on the flavor as actually probably distilling to lower ABV before you take off, which was my original point. Yes, Joe dropping in saying, can we start a fundraiser for Better Internet for Fionnán? Absolutely. His house, I think, is actually tin lined. It's lead lined, which has created a kind of a natural Faraday cage over his home. So perhaps we can raise a fundraiser for a different roof. But to everyone who has joined us this evening, I know Fionnán is quite the font of information, and I hope you've enjoyed learning about some of the history of mixed mash bill distillation with column stills. Very much an industry of efficiency in both costs as well as alcohol yields. Very interesting to see its origins start with the mixed mash bills of Potstilled and derive away in terms of economics of cost and pocket and volume and efficiencies in terms of the likes of labs and returns on yields, which has been absolutely fascinating to see as well. A lot of people dropping in from all over the world, not only fans of Irish whiskey, but also distillers of Irish whiskey, and a number of people who distill Scotch whiskey and blend Scotch whiskey, who are also, I know, interested very much in the topic of the history of grain whiskey in Scotland, and of course in Ireland as well. A very big thank you to Kilbeggan Distilling Company, and of course the Single Grain, and to everyone out there. I very much appreciate you joining us this evening, and perhaps we'll have to have Fionnán again maybe next week or the week after to continue the conversation about column still distilling, and I suppose the greater agroeconomics that led to the changes in mash bill history across Ireland, and I suppose a deeper understanding of Fionnán's research. Very big thank you to you all, and to our sponsor Kilbeggan Distilling Company, and of course to Fionnán O'Connor. And to all of you, good night. Thank you.